This is going to be the last installment of the realities of slavery in the Bible. It's reasoning through the Bible, slavery apologetics. This is part 4 now, I think, because these slavery apologetics were really long, and that got me really excited because I thought they would bring up new points and maybe present this in a way that I hadn't thought of before, which is kind of wishful thinking because what's the best light that you can paint slavery in? It's still pretty dark, but we're going to get into it. I want to finish this video up today, and there's still 20 minutes or so left of it. So let's go. But before that, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. Give me a thumbs up if you enjoy my content. And if you don't, give me a thumbs down. That's great too. Lets me know that, hey, my content's not the best. That's okay. Let's finish this up today. I'm bored with this. So let's go.
So, comment, Steve. Did I miss it, or what are your thoughts as we go through the?
No, I'm in agreement with you. You know, another thing that I've heard the skeptics say, kind of as a pause at this particular point in time, they said, to throw it out there, said, you know, to people, well, would you go underneath and become a slave under the rules outlined in Exodus chapter 21? And my response is, yeah, given the conditions that we've laid out and the reasons why, and also known from other type of archaeological finds of how the other nations in the ancient Near East treated people and treated their slaves. Yes, the slaves that were here, the servants, they were there for because they were starving, because they had made agreements in order to do it. They were freed after a period of time, after 7 years. Even in Jubilee years, they were free.
Okay, I'm going to pause really quickly. I won't touch on this too long, but I would never sell my freedom. Freedom is kind of the only thing. It's, you know, nobody can, that's something that nobody should ever be able to take away. Freedom should not be commerce. It should not be bartered. It should not be in the equation of paying off debts or simply not starving to death, especially if you're living in a society that is directly governed by God himself. You have a failed society. God, you have failed your society. Your people are so hungry that they are selling themselves into slavery to eat. And he's probably lying. He probably wouldn't sell himself into slavery, but all of that is beside the point, because the fact of the matter is that this type of slavery, while as despicable, heinous, and disgusting as it is, especially when the governor of your society is the creator of the universe, but what about the people who didn't have an option? What about the people who were bought as property for life? Forever. That's the slavery in the Bible that's the most disgusting. That's chattel slavery. But I've noticed in this very long series that they've had, they mentioned it, they briefly talked about it, they said that all of the same rules apply. They lied about it. I'm gonna flat out call it. They simply lied about it. But let's keep going.
As well, they had rights. They could go before judges
these guys
if
up.
they were
talk
mistreated.
A little bit slow.
So yes, given under that particular point in time, yes, I would go and live underneath. I'd rather live under those conditions that were laid out by God with the Israelites than I would be with the Canaanites and the other ones that were around who mistreated and didn't have these type of rules.
Right.
So I would like to see the evidence of the nations that surrounded Israel of what their rules on slavery were. I genuinely don't know. Maybe they were awful, maybe they were great, but that doesn't matter, because that's not the argument here. Is biblical slavery the worst kind of slavery you could imagine? The argument here is, did a moral God permit immoral acts? And the answer, of course, is yes, which then makes him an immoral God. But they cannot admit that, so that's why they create this video series.
Right. And so, again, just to summarize the Old Testament, the slaves had rights. They could not be bruised. They could not be beaten. The passage in Exodus 21 that talks about
Again, here, I covered this in the last one, but if he's bringing it up again, I'm going to bring it up again. He's lying. The passages that say that bruise for bruise, wound for wound, tooth for tooth, eye for eye, they do not apply to slaves. They just simply don't. To suggest that they do is such a perversion of the Bible, which is, hey, it's already a pretty grossly immoral book, but it's such you're twisting the words around so much to make them fit what you want it to say, and it just so clearly doesn't say it. So no, you could absolutely 100% beat your slave. You could just stop lying about it.
About beating a slave is talking about not paying back the owner because it was his money. And again, that verse 20 Exodus 21:21 does not override the other verses in that chapter and the ones we just read, which says everybody has to be treated equally.
So, excuse me, everybody has to be treated equally. But what I find funny is that every time they say this, they then go through an entire list of things that specifically list of how slaves, how not everybody was treated equally. They're like, everybody was treated equally. Then they give a list of ways that not everybody was treated completely differently, mainly slave and free man. And I was going through Exodus 21 today, and I wanted to touch on this very quickly. They read a passage, I don't remember which video it was in, about if a bull gores. You know what? We'll bring it up quickly and then we'll get back to it, because I think it's important, because there's just simply such a distinction between the way slaves were treated and the way non-slaves were treated. So I thought this was funny because they keep going on and on about how the laws apply equally, but they're so let's just read it. So this says, if a bull gores a man or a woman to death, the bull is to be stoned to death, and its meat must not be eaten for some reason. But the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. Okay? If, however, the bull has had a habit of goring, and the owner has been warned, but has not kept it penned up, and it kills a man or woman, the bull is to be stoned, and its owner is also to be put to death. However, if payment is demanded, the owner may redeem his life by the payment of whatever is demanded. So this is saying that it's almost like the very first time a bull gets loose and kills somebody, you kill the bull. If, however, the bull has had a habit of goring, okay, it doesn't matter. Sorry. If, however, the bull has a habit of goring, so in this circumstance, if the bull kills, yeah, it does say if it kills. So this doesn't make sense either, right? This is a complete side point, but so it says if a bull gores a man or woman to death, the bull is to be stoned, and the owner will not be held responsible. If, however, the bull has habit. Okay, I see. Okay, I'm just stupid. That's all. My bad. It's basically saying that if out of the blue a bull kills a person, the owner's not to be held responsible. But if the bull has had a habit of hurting people, and then eventually it kills somebody, then you kill the owner of the bull, because he knew it hurt people, but it hadn't killed anybody yet. However, if payment is demanded, the owner may redeem his life by payment of whatever is demanded. So there's a way to get out of the death sentence. This law also applies if the bull gores a son or daughter, which is interesting because I thought son or daughter would, maybe if it kills a kid, I don't know. Okay, but here we go. Here's that long-winded way of getting to what I was trying to say. If the bull gores a male or female slave, the owner of the bull must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave. Okay? So they left this part out. They tried to make it sound, and again, this is without hearing what they actually said. But in which way is this justice for the slave? If the bull gores a male or female slave, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave. And I apologize because without remembering exactly what they said earlier, it's a little bit out of context. But essentially what they said earlier is that if a bull gores a man or a woman, then they could get maybe they could get less than 30 shekels, maybe they can get more than 30 shekels, but this was a way to guarantee that shekels were paid. So they try to make it sound like a protection of the slave. But the money goes to the master of the slave, not to the slave himself. And I just wanted to touch on that because as I was reading it, I was like, wait a second. Those guys tried to make it sound sound like the slave was to be compensated, but it 100% says to the master of the slave. And if I remembered which video they said this in, I would go back and play the clip, but I don't remember. It's 3 videos long. I'm not going back through all of it. I just wanted to point that out, but let's keep going.
Eye for eye, bruise for bruise, stripe for stripe. So you cannot beat them without them claiming, hey, they maimed me and I get to be set free. I'm free of my bond. And so all of these protections were in place. And it's just not true that people were treated like property. They had rights, all the full rights of citizenship required by the Mosaic Law.
And it also talked about in chapter 21, verse 16.
Another flat out lie. All the full rights of citizenship required by Mosaic Law. Again, it's just so stupid. If just think about it for a second, and you have to realize that. So they openly admit in the beginning of this series that the ancient Israelites, they didn't have a prison system. So what do you do with all these people who were prisoners? Well, essentially you make them slaves. That's now that I'm not talking about this form of indentured servitude that they keep going on about. I'm talking about actual, like, just slaves. What do you do with, like, captives of war, people who you either kill them or make them slaves, basically? So what they're actually arguing is that prisoners of war it's gonna sound stupid, but this is what they're saying. They've said it many times. I've said this many times, but this is what they're saying, is that prisoners of war, captives from an army of a nation that you are at war with, are given full rights of citizenship and to be treated equally under the law, just as everybody else. And come on, let's come on.
Where it completely forbade for any slaves to be that were kidnapped or stolen. The literal word there is steal, which breaks the 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal. It says not only the ones who are steal, or if they are found in your hand. In other words, if the slave was found to be owned by the person through the means of kidnapping or stealing, the penalty for that owner was death. So once again, the things that we think about as far
real quick, I'll touch on this. This is a non-argument. Fine. I don't care. I don't care. Yes, I'm even going to grant that this law applies to all nations. I don't care. Okay, fine. You couldn't kidnap people, but you could certainly purchase kidnapped people.
As far as people in the slave trade that were taken and taken away from.
I mean, just to clarify, what I mean by that is, so it says you are to buy your slaves from the nations around you. If an Israelite was to go to the nation around them to buy a slave, what's the process to determine where that slave came from? If the slave owner said, "Hey, this is a war captive of ours. We're trying to get rid of him," and the person's like, "No, he stole me." You know what I mean? What are they going to verify it? Like, nobody's going to verify this. They would just there was a slave system, I guess, is what I'm getting at. It doesn't matter.
From their homes and kidnapped from their homes and sold by other tribes.
And not to mention, just quickly, in previous videos, they clearly state how it's totally acceptable to kidnap people. They gave a little anecdote from the Bible where a husband who was a slave owed money to somebody. I don't remember the names or whatever. It was Joshua or something silly, but So the slave, the male slave dies. Well, there's still a debt to be paid. So the debtors, no debtors, the the uh the people who the money was owed to, are those debtors? I don't know. I'm stupid. Um, they came and took the children because the male slave, the dad died. He couldn't repay the debts. So they came and took the children to work off the rest of the debt. I'm sorry. I don't care who you are. That's kidnapping.
To Europeans and others in the 817s and 1800s, that was completely and without question forbidden by God to the people of Israel as well. So once again, would you live underneath the rules laid out here in chapter 21? Yes, because if I was a slave, that was.
So would you live under the laws laid out in chapter 21? He's saying yes. So he would 100% sell his daughter into slavery. That's what he's saying right now. You can't pick and choose which laws you're going to follow. He's saying yes, he would be a slave himself, but he would also follow all of the rules laid out in chapter 21, which is selling your daughter into slavery. How is that voluntary? It's all so stupid.
Had been kidnapped. Even if I was found to have been within, guess what? The penalty for the person that had me was death. So yes.
I have personally met people that were citizens of countries that were the worst of communism, the absolute worst of communism, the worst you could.
Aside from this side point, at least when I go off on my long tangents, I'm responding to them. Their videos are as long as they are because they talk about nothing. They talk about so many other things than slavery apologetics. And while they have brought up some new terrible points, like the whole the reason God commanded genocide is because the women had STDs. It doesn't matter. They brought up a couple new ones. The reason their videos are so long is because they just talk about other stuff that's not slavery.
Imagine of being in communist control, of telling you every move to make, what you're going to do for a living, the absolute worst. They were very poor, and when I asked them what was it like being under that, and they said, in one sense, yeah, we didn't have hardly anything, but in one sense it was comforting because we didn't have any stress. There were no decisions that we could make because there were no choices. And in one sense, they were kind of feeling, the person I was talking to felt a little nostalgic about it. He says, if we went back under that, I wouldn't have all the stress I have now. And so, again, talking about the question, would you sign up for this? If I had a guarantee of all the...
Is he a communist? With some of the things that I've heard him say, I just kind of figured him for like a moderate Republican. Not like like a far right wing extremist or anything, but just a moderate Republican. I mean, is he advocating for communism right now? Interesting.
Protections in the Mosaic Law. I can't be beaten. If I do, I get to go to court. They have to feed.
No, you don't get to go to court. It doesn't say you get to go to court. It just doesn't. Stop lying. You're a liar.
They have to treat me with all the rights of all the other citizenship. I work off
Absolutely
my agreement
not.
and I get to go free. If they hurt me, I get to go free. Then I could do that if I was hungry enough. Guaranteed job. And if I found a wife, I could either wait till 7 years until she gets off and
No, see, this is another flat out lie he's telling. It's not wait until the 7 years. It says you know what? Here, we'll bring it up. We'll read it line for line. We'll read it line for line. Am I sharing this page? Hold on. We're going to read this. We'll read it. We'll go over it because he's just lying. So if a master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free. Now, the laws in this are very sex specific, male and female. It's it's what it says. he is to serve you, he shall go free. If he comes alone, he is to go free. But if he has a wife, when he comes, she is to go with him. If the master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife, and do not want to go free, then his master must take him for the judges. He shall take him to the door, basically pierce his ear. Then he will be his servant for life. This does not say in any way, shape, or form that the woman is to go free after 7 years. Under what circumstance? Under what circumstance? It's so obvious that it's kind of hard to explain. So I'm going to try to do my best. So you have a male slave, and the master gives him a wife, and she bears him, and they have kids. He's to go free. But if he wants to remain with those kids and his wife, he's going to be his master. The slave's going to go back to the master for life, forever. Under what circumstance, if it's true that the woman is going to go free after her 7 years are up, under what circumstance would you go back to the master for life? Why wouldn't you just wait until her term is up and then you can go be free with your family? Why would you go back for life? And I don't know what he's going to say after this, but my guess is he's going to say something to the effect of, well, maybe they were treated well and they were fed well. And maybe that's the case. But if that is the case, I mean, why not just keep being why is it for life? Why? That's the key question here, is why, if he goes back to his master, is it for life and not for an additional 7 years? Or maybe they could work out a contract. Okay, well, I think after 3 more years, I could save up a little bit more money, because according to him, slaves were paid like $13 trillion a year, and then go free and live with your family. Well, I'll tell you why it's for life, because the wife and children belong to the master for life. That's why you would go back and you're going to be his slave for life, because the women and children were his slave for life. They are not to go free. Only the man shall go free. Come on, think about it. It's so bad. It's so bad. It's stupid. Let's go.
We get to stay married, or I can stay there and work for the person. And it's all these protections are there. Now that's Old Testament. That's Old Testament. Let's look at the New Testament, because New Testament
The New Testament is, I don't care about New Testament stuff, because it's supposedly the same God. So either you're conceding that these gods are not the same, which completely, I mean, the foundation of your religion crumbles, or you're saying that God has changed his mind, and that stuff in the New Testament is, they changed stuff, but this God is supposed to be all-knowing, unchanging, eternal. So you're conceding an argument when you accept the New Testament, but don't accept the Old. You got to take it all, or somewhere you're giving some ground on how powerful your God is claimed to be.
talks about slavery as well. And again, we're trying to hit all these verses right between the eyes, not dodging anything. There's passages in the New Testament, we'll admit right up front, that tell bond slaves to obey their masters. It says it several times. Ephesians 6, verses 5 to 9.
Yeah.
Colossians 3:22, 1 Timothy 6:1, Titus 2:9, 1 Peter 2:18. All those passages say that if you're a bond slave, then you should obey your master, right? So,
I'll take his word for it. I'm curious if it actually does say bond slave specifically in all those verses, but it doesn't matter. I'll take his word for it. I can almost guarantee that in some instances it don't, and especially depending on which translation you're reading, but I bet it doesn't say bond slave. He's adding that in. He's adding that in for what I suspect to be a reason of some sort, so we'll see.
what's the alternative? What would be the advice? I've heard people say, oh, my advice would be to tell them to run away. Well, or disobey or work stoppage or whatever, if they, again, you're speaking to Christians, and so
I will agree with what he just said. The other people are saying, if you're a slave, gain your freedom at all costs, because freedom is the most valuable thing humans have. And unfortunately, it's not something that's guaranteed to everybody. Freedom isn't necessarily a human right. I mean, it ought be, but that's not the world we actually live in. If you're a slave, do everything you can to escape your get free.
so first of all, as Christians, what's going to happen to the cause of Christ if you're a bond slave and you're under this bond, this obligation to this owner and that owns my bond? Then what's going to happen if I become a bad worker?
And I'm curious. So in almost every other verse that he's brought up, if not every verse, but at least most, if not all, he's brought up the actual passages. I'm curious why. Maybe he will, but I'm curious why he didn't bother to put those on
What's that
screen.
going to do to the cause of Christ? And so that's one of the
Kinda wanna
concerns.
look 'em
That's one
up.
of the reasons they say that. Again, New Testament written to believers. And so the alternative is either run away, in which case you've defrauded the person that paid your bond, and that's stealing. If I run away from the bond, then I'm stealing. The other alternative is stay there but be disobedient, in which case you're going to give a bad reputation to Christ and invite punishment on yourself for not meeting your obligation.
Oh, um, wow. I'm not sure what to. I'm not sure what to say to that. It, you should remain a slave, because if you run away, you're going to defraud your debt. If you do remain a slave, then at least you're not defrauding on your debt. But if you're disobedient, you're going to somehow humiliate Jesus Christ, Lord and Savior, ultimate creator, all-knowing, omniscient, all-powerful God of the. Okay, hold on, I gotta hear that again.
Person that paid your bond, and that's stealing. If I run away from the bond, then I'm stealing. The other alternative is stay there but be disobedient, in which case you're going to give a bad reputation to Christ and invite punishment on yourself for.
Hey, you know that Christ guy everybody keeps talking about? Yeah, man, he's like the Lord and Savior. He's coming to wash away all of our sins. Yeah. Well, I heard a slave was disobedient.
Not meeting your obligation.
Okay, no. We're gonna go. I want to finish this
Or
video today.
stay
How
there,
ridiculous!
But be obedient and be a good witness and work off your bond.
So as far as I can tell, that as far as I can remember, there's a passage that said, "Slaves, obey your masters, especially the cruel ones." You know, because heaven is great, or whatever. Is he gonna touch on that where it says, "Obey your masters, especially the cruel ones"? But remember, slave masters couldn't be cruel. They couldn't, because otherwise the slave was given a mansion and a Ferrari.
So what's the alternative? Again, if we don't look at this through only the lens of what we saw as Western slavery, and then it's a very different picture.
Yeah, the context of those that you gave there is in regards to an order. And so it's not just talking about servants, it also talks about the children and how the people should also obey the government, because the government is provided by God as well. And so there's other things in related that's in those contexts. It's not just with the bondservant. One other thing before we go further too is there was another condition where a person, and we didn't read it, but if they decided they were set free, in other words, the seventh year had come up and they were set free, they had an option to stay. And if they voluntarily wanted to stay with the family, with the ownership, and be with them, they would become a voluntary servant to them. And what would happen would be is that they would take and prescribe. The prescription was for them to take an awl, put it in their ear, in order to signify, and then a ring there to signify that they were a voluntary bond servant or voluntary. And what would happen?
Hold on, I gotta go back. I'm trying to find the passage about. Is it Peter? 1 Peter 2:18. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only those who are good and considerate, but also those who are harsh. Let me pop this up on screen. You who are slaves must submit to your masters with all respect. Do what they tell you, not only if they are kind and reasonable, but even if they are cruel. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. Servants, submit yourselves to your masters with all respect, not only those who are gentle, but even to those who are unreasonable. Servants, be subject to your masters with fear. You get the point. So, earlier, just a few moments ago, I was curious why they didn't bring some of these passages up on screen, and I think that's why. But I was looking for that passage, so I didn't hear the last few lines of what he said.
Voluntarily wanted to stay with the family, with also obey the government, because the government is provided by God as well. And so there's other things in related that's in those contexts.
It's interesting that the government was provided by God as well, because a lot of people don't like the government right now, but it does say that people who are in government were appointed by God. Were they speaking specifically of their society? Well, not necessarily, but that's a side point.
It's not just with the bondservant. One other thing before we go further too is there was another condition where a person, and we didn't read it, but if they decided they were set free, in other words, the seventh year had come up and they were set free, they had an option to stay. And if they voluntarily wanted to stay with the family, with the ownership, and be with them, they would become a voluntary servant to them. And what would happen would be
that's what he just said. What do you mean one other thing before we move forward? That's what he just said. But it's interesting that he's painting it in a different picture than what the other dude said, because he's saying if they wanted to stay with the family. The other guy made it sound as though the wife was going to be set free. He's making it seem he's doing it. He's saying it correctly. If he wanted to stay with his family, because if the family wasn't going to be set free,
is that they would take and prescribe. The prescription was for them to take an awl, put it in their ear in order to signify, and then a ring there to signify that they were a voluntary bond servant or voluntary servant, a slave to that family or to that owner, patriarch that was there. Now, this is to put in context in regards to what was going on with other nations. In the Babylonian rules, that is noted as the Babylonian Hammurabi Code, that was found on the steel that had all this code that was there. Code number 282. If a male slave has said to his master, "You are not my master," his master shall prove him to be his slave and cut off his ear. So here's in the Babylon, you didn't have the opportunity to say, look, I don't want to be your slave anymore, right? You weren't set free after 7 years. And if you did speak up and say, hey, I don't want, guess what? They cut your ear off. Things like this that
I'm curious what they cut out. You see little jumps throughout this. I'm very curious. It doesn't matter. They probably cut out all the mistakes, which I should probably do as well, because and I stutter. Whatever, it doesn't matter. I don't care what the other nations were doing, because the other nations didn't have an all-powerful creator of the universe giving them their rules. They were doing the best they could with the knowledge that they had in a relatively ancient and ignorant time period. Their rules made sense for them at the time. Of course, we now recognize them as cruel and barbaric and archaic, just like these laws. But the only difference is that God didn't give them their laws. They came up with it, almost like these people did.
That people look at it and say, oh, how barbaric to put an awl into the ear and to show that he was a possession of the other. Again, put it in the context of what was going on in the ancient Near East for all of these other countries or nations that were going on, and the cruelties that were actually take place in these other countries.
Right. So it's very different. The people in the Old Testament and the New Testament had rights and protections. Let's look at a couple of verses in the New Testament that does deal specifically with this idea of slavery. In 1 Corinthians 7, verse 23,
man, I don't want to do
bought
New
at a price.
Testament.
Do not become slaves of men. So look at that verse for a second. First of all, it's talking about salvation. You were bought at a price. So our salvation is compared to this idea of a bond slave. Somebody paid for you. And so you are now under this obligation to them. But more practically, look at the second part of that. Do not become slaves of men. Well, that assumes that somebody has the control over whether or not I'm going to become a slave or not.
Right.
It's, again, if somebody were to knock me in the back of the head and kidnap me in the dark of night and haul me off to a slave market, I wouldn't have much control over that. But this command is, you are already paid for by Jesus Christ. Don't go and make yourself a slave of men. That assumes that I have control over whether or not I'm a slave of men, which again is why we belabor the point. If I go into an obligation, I've borrowed money.
You may sell your daughter. Where's the control? Where's the daughter's choice? There's one example of how this guy is lying. There's many other. We've been over them.
And I can't pay it back, I'm going to turn into a bond slave. And so he's saying, don't do that.
Right.
Saying, don't become a slave. Don't voluntarily put yourselves under the slavery of men. The slavery in many cases was voluntary. If it wasn't voluntary, it's prisoners of war. That is the vast majority of what we're talking about here. And kidnapping and slave markets were prevented. You couldn't do that. So the next one, if we look at another passage is in Philemon. There's a little book in the New Testament called Philemon. It's only one chapter. It's written from the Apostle Paul to a man named Philemon. There was a runaway slave by the name of Onesiphorus. And Onesiphorus had run away from Philemon and had met the Apostle Paul and had become a Christian. And Paul had written this letter to his friend Philemon, who was also a believer in Christ, and had given it to Onesiphorus and sent it back to Philemon. So the letter in the New Testament of Philemon is a letter about this slave that is now a Christian and was returning to his master. And so a couple of key verses here. Look at Philemon, verse 16. No longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. And look down at verse 18. But if he has wronged you in any way or owes you anything, charge that to my account. So what is he saying? He's saying the slave, treat him like a brother.
Right.
I mean, again, look at 16. Don't treat him like a slave, more than a slave, a beloved brother. Treat him like a beloved brother. And oh yeah, by the way, that bond that he was under.
I don't care about any of this because everything that we have talked about prior to these passages, the people didn't have all of this stuff. The New Testament was what, 1500, roughly 1500 years later. They didn't have access to any of this. So all of this is completely irrelevant to Old Testament biblical slavery.
I'll pay it. If he still owes you anything.
I just want to go real quick to Deuteronomy 20 because this passage often gets overlooked and it's going to war. We'll read it quickly. When you go to war against your enemies and see horses and hold on, we're just going to get to it. We won't read all of it. So Deuteronomy 20:10, when you march up to attack a city, not defend yourselves, but when you march up to attack a city, make its people, its citizens, not its army, its people an offer of peace. If they accept peace, they don't want war, and they open their gates, all of the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. If they refuse to make peace and they engage you in battle, lay siege to that city, and then it goes on to say, slaughter every single person, completely destroy them. The Hittites, I don't know, Amorites, Canaanites, all of these people. I don't know how to say all this. Otherwise, they will teach you a lesson when you lay siege. A long time fighting. Okay, it doesn't matter. The point here is that what's voluntary about this? If they make peace, they shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. But also, according to these guys, they get all of the rights and they can simply run. It's all stupid. But this passage is overlooked a lot. Deuteronomy 20:10, I do believe it is. Yeah, 20:10. If they make peace, all of the people shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. There's no voluntarism here. I just wanted to point that out because that passage often gets overlooked.
So again, this isn't chattel slavery. This guy Onesiphorus, for whatever reason, had an obligation to Philemon, and the obligation has to get paid. And Paul says if he hasn't worked at
And I'm completely fine with the notion that the situation that he's describing, which I totally didn't listen to because it's boring and irrelevant, but I'm fine with the notion that this whatever he just described wasn't chattel slavery. But why not talk about the actual chattel slavery in the Bible? Not this other stuff.
off yet, put it on my account. But meanwhile, treat him like not just a
Oy.
brother, a beloved brother, not like a
Oh, this video is already 40 minutes long, but we're finishing it.
And so this is the picture in the New Testament. Did they go and try to overthrow governments and change secular laws in the Roman Empire? No, they were trying to start a church. So we can't have it one way and say, oh, we want separation of church and state, which means we don't want you messing around in the government. But then
You can't say that for the people of 2,000 years ago. That's arguments that we make in America today. Separation of church and state. You can't argue church. No, shut up. Stop.
on the other hand, say, why didn't you mess around in the government? I mean, you can't have it both ways. If we really look at what the New Testament says, okay, maybe we could say that they should have done it another way, but they were being moral to these people, and they were telling them to obey the law instead of disobey the law. Now, to me, Steve, all of that whole thing about slavery boils down to something that I think is missing in most of these conversations, which is how are we described as our relationship with Jesus Christ as Christians? What this whole slavery thing gives us
slaves to Christ. Yes. Christians are slaves to
a
Christ.
picture
Yeah.
of what the New Testament says our relationship is in Christ.
Well, we're noted as bond slaves. In other words, we're noted as ones who have voluntarily
Okay. So they only have a 7-year obligation to Christ to fulfill. That's nice.
decided to become a believer in Jesus Christ.
I don't see any piercing on his ear. He has been freed in the year of Jubilee, or his 7-year contract is up. There's no piercing on his ear. You didn't take yourself before the judges and become a slave to Christ for life.
Christ, and that we should serve him that way.
And this theme about slavery is picked up by the Apostle Paul and others in the New Testament, and this makes a great description of our salvation and what Jesus did for us.
Yeah.
In Romans chapter 6, pretty much the whole chapter talks about when we start out as human beings, we are a slave to sin. We're a slave to sin. That's the description of the law.
How are we a slave to sin when somebody died on the cross for our sins? How are we still a slave to sin?
Lost person. But then Jesus comes along and pays our debt. Romans
So we're no longer a slave to sin? We're sin free now.
6:18, having
I thought you can't have it both ways. Are we born sinners? Are we still slaves to sin? Is sin washed away and forgiven?
been freed from sin, you became slaves of righteousness, unquote. So we start out as a slave for sin, and we have this obligation to be paid. It will get paid. Jesus came along and paid our sin debt. And so now, since he paid for us, we're bought with a price. We're his now. And that's the wonderful relationship. And we lose that picture when we mischaracterize biblical slavery, which was this bond slave. There was a bond involved, an obligation that had to get paid. And Jesus paid our debt for us. That's the good news.
Correct. And we went through in part one and put it in context in regards to what, that again, words change and meanings of words change throughout centuries. And so putting it in context, go back and listen in part one of that, where we put those meaning of slavery or servitude in context.
And we'll wrap up with this. If you've listened to us this far, everyone is a slave to something. Everyone is a slave to something. You, sir, you, madam, are a slave to something. You're either a slave to your own sin, you're a slave to your own personal.
Yeah, so we can still be a slave to sin, even though the sin was forgiven. He just said it. He just said we're no longer slaves to sin.
Fleshly desires, or you're
Yeah.
going to accept Jesus and become a bond slave of Christ and let him become your master. And if that
Interesting that when you're a slave, when it's sin, you're a slave to sin. When it's Jesus, you're a bond slave.
Happens, then now we're a slave to righteousness. We're a slave to Jesus Christ. And that's what the message is in the New Testament. And that's really the good news.
Yeah, and then also finishing up, I want to say this as well for the believers that are listening here. This is an example of how you address topics that skeptics and God haters.
Okay, if you are a believer and you made it this far into my series, this is a terrible way to address this topic. It's disgusting, it's immoral, it's barbaric, it's archaic, it's so bad. Please don't listen to these guys. If you come across an atheist and you decide to get into a discussion with him about biblical slavery, do not use anything from this absolute trash apologetics. These are so bad. From just flat out lying to misleading to being dishonest. They covered all of the grounds. Don't use these. It don't do that. Don't do it.
Want to bring up in order to take believers and take them away from God, or even keep other people from becoming believers in God. Take these sessions, here, send them to your children, especially if your children are getting ready to go to college. Because guess what? Within about 2 or 3 hours of them being with their first professor who is a God hater or an atheist or doesn't believe in God, they will bring things up like this. And if they're not prepared or don't know what the context is, then they will have doubts. And some of them even go to the what's popular these days is to deconstruct and go away from their faith that they have. These are
Don't have
topics
doubts.
that we've gone through. We've taken 3 parts. We've taken 3 sessions to go through these and explain what this is. Send them to your friends and family. Send them to your daughters and children, especially if they're getting ready to go off to college. Let them listen from God's perspective and God's point of view and put them in context of what's going on related to this. Don't just turn them over to the skeptics, the atheists, and the God haters just for them to misrepresent the Bible and misrepresent God.
Right. So we'll end here. With that, we'll call the slavery session to an end. And we thank you for staying with us. We try to reason through these carefully. It's a lot easier for the skeptics to just throw out an accusation really quick, and it takes us a while to kind of explain the true context. But we'd rather do it carefully. That's what we do on Reasoning Through the Bible.
Okay, so to cap off my series on their series, these were bad. These were really they were just he tried to justify people coming in and taking your children as a way of paying off a debt, because a slave is your money, as he puts it, as the Bible puts it, but as he puts it. So if you're a slave, you are money, and if you die, you're no longer money, so your children then become money. They defended genocide because the women may have had STDs and completely glossed over the children that were supposed to be killed. But you could also keep the virgins. Why? Well, because they're virgins. They probably don't have STDs. But let's gloss over how you attest if somebody is a virgin or not. Everything in this series was bad. There wasn't a single good point. There were new points, I'll give them that. There's some stuff that came out of their mouths that I hadn't heard before, which was semi nice in an awful way. But don't defend slavery. Don't defend genocide. Just don't do it. Just don't do it. All right. I'm glad to be done with this series. So we're ending it here. Thank you for listening.